Going into round 7 of the Sinquefield Cup, 2 players shared the lead, Magnus Carlsen and Levon Aronian. Let's see how they both got on in round 7. First of all, Nakamura against Aronian. Now, this is a mainline Spanish, and Aronian, well, he usually stays true to his opening repertoire. He's played this position many times before, and he's offering the opportunity for white to enter into a martial gambit with c3 and then d5. But Nakamura very quickly played an anti-martial move, a4, and Aronian is very familiar with this system. I mean, one can play bishop b7 in this position, but Aronian likes to play b4. He really stays true to his the opening systems that he likes. Very well researched. Both players playing very quickly, it's all very standard, and they headed into this endgame. A slightly surprising decision because, well, at least on the part of Nakamura, because this endgame is very well known to Aronian. He's played this on a number of occasions. For example, 2 years ago in the Sinquefield Cup against Carlsen. Now, this is how this game went. Carlsen ended up winning this game, but actually Aronian stood extremely well. Nakamura played instead bishop c4, but again Aronian has faced this move previously. Here Aronian played king f8 against Karyarkin. On this occasion he played rook e8, and this turned out very well. Basically he's preparing to play the bishop into e6, and the game continued like this, and you could see that, you know, Hikaru is going back and forth with this bishop, and very quickly it became apparent that Hikaru really didn't have much up his sleeve in this position. And round about here already Aronian is very pleasantly placed. Although white controls this square c4, actually there's not a lot you can do about it, and in fact it's this pawn on a5 which turns out to be weak. Now I'm going to leap ahead a few moves to move 27, and just as in that game 2 years ago against Carlsen, Aronian has succeeded in targeting, after the exchange of bishops here, Aronian has succeeded in targeting that a5 pawn with 2 knights and a rook, and you can see that these rooks and the knight, I mean, they're slightly ridiculously placed. Nakamura has to do this to defend the pawn. Now, in that game against Carlsen, Aronian made the terrible mistake of capturing this pawn too soon. In this game, he played it much better. Well, first of all, this is a very nice idea. Instead of exchanging bishops, which is possible, he exchanged off bishop for knight, and this means that, well, these 2 knights are very effective hopping around in this fairly closed position. This bishop really doesn't have a good diagonal to go to. This is a good strategic decision, and this pawn is still vulnerable, but Aronian doesn't take it too quickly, which would actually give these rooks something to do. So instead he just little by little improved his position. First of all, bringing the king into the centre. Well, that's very nice. Just sitting very comfortably there and preparing perhaps to advance with g6 and f5. And here Nakamura preempted that by playing g4. I think in these kind of positions where, you know, one side is rather passively placed, it is very difficult to know how to defend. If Nakamura had just waited, then, you know, black does have a very simple idea of playing g6 and f5 to either weaken this pawn or, you know, force white into an exchange which would give black a nice pawn centre. And, you know, there's nice moves like advancing its h-pawn. So a gradual pawn advance on the king side looks very attractive for black. That's why Nakamura played g4, but this does leave weaknesses in his position, namely the f4 square, and that f3 pawn as well lacks protection. Let's see how Aronian exploited that. First of all, he's spinning his knight round into these weak squares. And a check. And now knight g5, targeting that pawn on f3. Of course, white could drop back with knight d2, a bit passive. There are ways for black to play that position. Instead, Nakamura made the very committal decision to give up bishop for knight. Doesn't mean his troubles are over here. Black's king can easily defend that isolated e-pawn, and what Aronian has done is open the f-file for his rooks, and now that knight on d4 does look really threatening. So looking at the pawn on f3, but also always that pawn on c2 under a bit of fire. And very simple plan now. Aronian switched rooks to the f-file. And now rook f1 looks like a better chance to defend that f-pawn. Black can still find ways to improve his position, perhaps g6 and h5 to switch to the h-file is a possibility. But in the game, Nakamura played rook a d1, which is a clear mistake. Incredibly, after the game, Aronian said that Nakamura offered a draw here, and he'd obviously completely underestimated Black's chances. After this move, Black is basically breaking through. After knight d2, knight takes c2 in this case is good. Nakamura played knight e5. He was running a bit short of time here, but after this trade, the rooks break through. White's king is dreadfully placed. First of all, Aronian throws in a few checks to just maximize the the positioning of his rooks, really. So these checks, the king has to go back, and only then he took on h2. So he's managed to bring his rooks to really powerful positions with those checks. And this is nice. After rook d5 check, Black doesn't have to take the pawn, which wouldn't be too good after a check, but instead it just ducks to the side and heads for the g4 pawn. White is utterly lost here. Let's just go through the final few moves. And in this position, okay, there was a threat to take on c2, that's why the rook went to c5. And now a nice little dink to the side, threatening mate. The king comes here, and now rook c3. And after this move, Nakamura resigned. After the trade of rooks, if white trades rook, you can see that little shimmy bringing the king over here means that it's impossible for white to prevent rook takes c2, and that really is over. Too many pawns screaming down the board, and in support, with the king in support, completely winning. So very sound game from Aronian. He's so experienced in this endgame, but you have to question Nakamura's decision to go in for that. Now let's go to Magnus Carlsen against Alexander Grischuk. Carlsen plays into Grischuk's Najdorf. Didn't get much out of the opening. It was roughly level, but round about the time control, Carlsen went wrong, and Grischuk won a pawn. They went into this endgame of rook, bishop, and 3 pawns against rook, knight, and 2. And now this is move 59. They were running right down to their final minutes, sometimes even their final seconds. They are given 30 seconds increment per move, but still very tough ending to play when you're short of time. Grischuk is pressing. He played rook e7 check. Obviously, if the king moves away, then the knight can be taken by the king. So Carlsen has to put the rook in the way. And now there are lots of different endgames possible with these exchanges. It's very hard for both sides to understand which is best to go for. In fact, I think in this position, king c3 is probably the best move. And in this endgame, I think black has good winning chances. I've been looking at these positions for some time, and it's very hard to say for absolute certain. But I think the trick here is that it's far easier for black's king to gain access to this h-pawn. Obviously, black can't lift the blockade, but that h-pawn is a target. Instead, rook e6 was played by Grischuk, and here Carlsen played f4, which I think should be a draw. But instead, I can't see a way for black to win this position. So basically, white has a blockade. If the king goes to c3, I don't see how black can lift this blockade at all. It's not possible for a Zugzwang position to reach. The bishop can rove around, but white's knight will always have a spot to go to. In this position, the most critical move, I think, is king d5. And then white has to be a little bit careful, but I think knight g4 should be a draw. So let's see. Black's only chance, I think, is to head with the king towards the h-pawn. So let's see how this works. e5. So this is trying to make room for the king to come around here. King d3, so nice blockade. King comes round. King e4. And now that defends the e-pawn. And at this point, either the knight or the king has to retreat. If the king retreats, then I think black is in. And this one is going to drop. Even there, I think white has chances. But I think it's simpler to play knight f2, and I think this is a clear draw. After king f6, threat to king g5, the knight just comes to h3, preventing the king coming here. Threatening to take this bishop, actually. If the bishop moves away, then this simplifies to a draw straight away. And here it's really easy. Well, basically the white king will take this pawn and heads back into the corner with a clear draw. Let me see. Let's go back. So I think rook takes e6 as a draw. I mean, maybe I'm missing something there, but I think it's possible for white to draw. Instead, Carlsen played f4, which I have to say I was watching this live, and I was slightly concerned when he played f4. One, it brings the pawn onto the same colour square as the bishop, and two, it potentially allows the king into the e4 square. The bishop dropped back. Carlsen exchanged, and here he made the final mistake. It looks to me like it's still a draw after king d2, and the point is this, that if the king tries to come round to e4, then, whoops, I beg your pardon, my mouse slipped there. If the king comes to e4, then this is still a draw with knight c5 check. And when the king goes over to the h-pawn, it's possible to take this pawn, give up the knight, and this is of course a theoretical draw. The king stays in the corner and it's not possible for the bishop to drive out the king. It's the wrong colour bishop. King d2, still a draw in that position, but instead Magnus, short of time, played knight f2, and now it's gone. Let's see how Grischuk managed to do this. So bishop e7. Now here, if white tries to maintain this blockade, he runs into Zugzwang. The knight can't move because the f-pawn would be taken. And when the king comes here, now everything works perfectly for black. And the king comes into e4. White is too late to get a blockade. Carlsen played knight g4. If knight takes h6, then this wins, and it's very neat actually. Now you can't allow the knight to come back to take the pawn, but bishop c5. That's the power of the bishop, controlling these squares, and the d-pawn rolls through. Carlsen played f5. Well, this is just desperation. This was taken. He's hoping to bring the knight back in another way, but after king c2, he had to resign. Let's just see how things would work. You give a check, and once again bishop c5 is a killer move, covering all these potential knight squares, and the king is very unfavourably placed on f3. If white tries to charge the pawn home, then d1 is check. Well, Carlsen said after the game that it was an absolutely dreadful game. The way I lost it is really shameful. He looked really distraught after that. So the scores after 7 rounds, Levon Aronian has 5 points out of 7. He's a point clear of the field. Giri, Grischuk and Carlsen all have 4 points. So with just 2 rounds to go, Levon Aronian looking very well placed.